Narrator Brian Brooks from Movie Line, and tonight's guest, Roger Michell.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
So I just want to set up the sort of the historical context of the trailer and the movie that you guys just watched at the moment. This came at a real pivotal moment, historically speaking. And I want you to just kind of, in Britain was at a major crossroads in its 20th century history. And I want you to sort of just kind of describe like what was at stake.
Yeah, sure. So this is June 1939, so it's 12 weeks before war broke out in Europe, before England, because of Hitler's invasion of Poland, became embroiled in a massive European conflict. And of course, at that time, and for good reason, many, indeed most people in this country didn't want to get involved in another war in Europe. You know, we hadn't paid reparations to you guys for the first war. The war seemed very far away, and it seemed a kind of bickering, aggressive affair between the old countries. Many of the population of the big metropolitan areas in this country were descendants of Italians or Germans. So the prospect of going back to war in Europe was remote. The King and the Queen, who came here on that mission, if you like, to try and curry favour for your participation, were not particularly popular either. And partly, and it was their first ever, the first time a reigning monarch had ever set foot either in America or in Canada. And they were partly unpopular because they were kings and queens in a country that was the cradle of proper democracy, but also partly because the glamorous elder brother of this stuttering, awkward, gauche king, who looked like a film star, the elder brother wasn't allowed to be king because he wanted to marry an American, of course. So all that was stacked against them when they came here. And they were nervous and they were vulnerable and they felt everybody hated them, and they went to Washington, they went to Congress, they were received in the White House, and then they had this specially planned weekend up the Hudson at Roosevelt's family house, the house owned by his mother. And our film takes place over that weekend and is about that weekend, which is simultaneously momentous and odd for many, many reasons.
And just a historic clarification, the King and Queen George VI and Queen Elizabeth are the parents of the current British monarch, Elizabeth II.
That's exactly right. And
okay.
They are,
yeah.
Of course, the King and Queen made famous by the King's Speech,
exactly,
which probably all of you saw a couple of years ago. And I want to talk about the King's Speech for a moment, which I loved. And it was a film that came while we were really in the middle of the process of putting our film together. This film started as a radio play. It's written by Richard Nelson, who's an American playwright who lives in Rhinebeck, a few miles from Springwood, from Roosevelt's house. And in fact, I'm meeting Richard in half an hour because he has another play about to open at the Public Theatre, a couple of blocks away from here. And we started working on the play and turning it into a screenplay, and then became aware that this other little film was being made on not a similar subject, but with similar characters. And then, of course, the film opened, and there was a sort of tsunami of success surrounding the wonderful King's Speech. And we began to think, well, what should we do? Should we not do our film? Should we abandon it? We don't want to be seen as jumping upon some regal bandwagon. So, in fact, we made this film kind of in spite of the King's Speech and not because of it. But I do think the King's Speech is going to help us because it's a good prequel. It's sort of like a marvelous Oscar-winning trailer for our film, and it means that those of you who've seen the King's Speech will be able to bring a lot of backstory to this different story, but a story featuring two of the same characters.
Yeah, and this is a very different story. Obviously, there's the American angle, which, of course, not so much in the King's Speech. But while there was also this political intrigue with the king and queen coming to visit Franklin Roosevelt at his family home upstate, there was also parallel a very personal sort of intrigue happening as well. And this actually, well, I'll let you kind of talk about that, but there was a woman involved who, with the president, and her notes sort of helped form the basis for what now became Hyde Park on Hudson.
This is a woman called Daisy Suckley. Daisy Suckley lived in Rhinebeck, and when she died around 15 years ago, in her 100th year, underneath her bed, she had left a box containing hundreds of letters between her and FDR, and diaries. And these were eventually published. The book is called Closest Companion, and it details an intimate relationship between the president and this rather shy, retiring, quiet spinster, which went on for many, many years. In the movie, she's played beautifully, wonderfully by Laura Linney, and as you say, the film is an account of a collision of these two stories over one moonlit weekend. It's a bit like, in a way, it's a bit like Midsummer Night's Dream. You know, there's a full moon under which all kinds of odd things take place, and the world turns in a strange and remarkable way. I mean, I'm not sure how much you're aware of the fact that FDR had quite a complicated domestic setup. He had an extremely sophisticated and quite modern relationship with his wife, and all this is, you know, widely written about, but I'm not sure that it's appeared on film in this way before, and it's remarkable and intriguing.
And then, but meanwhile, Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, is at this weekend, and she and FDR do seem to have a very important partnership. Would that be a fair way to describe that? No.
They have a fantastic partnership. I mean, I think they had an incredibly close and loving relationship, and I think they were great political partners as well. I mean, she would constantly bombard him with memos and demands and political ideas, and sometimes he got fed up with it because Eleanor kept beating the drum on her favourite issues. But I think she radicalised his politics in a way that was remarkable, and she obviously outlived him for many, many years and became an incredibly substantial political figure of her own.
I think what was really fantastic about this movie, and I think that, you know, I think people have heard a little bit about it in more modern times, but, you know, are all these women who have had a major influence over FDR, of course, Eleanor, but then also his mother. There was this one particular great scene where, and the house that they lived in was actually the mother's house. I mean, he was going up there on weekends, but it was her house, and she kind of ruled the roost. I mean, yes, he was president of the United States, but when he was drinking too much, she'd come in like blistering crazy woman, you know.
Well, there was a lot of bad drinking in that family. You know, her father, i.e. the mother's father, was a terrible bad drunk, and he died of drink. And so Mrs. Roosevelt, FDR's mum, was really, really risk-averse whenever the booze came out. And FDR liked to drink. You know, he liked to drink very much. He liked to drink, he liked to play cards. He needed to relax. You know, he had a lot going on, and he relaxed in very conventional ways. You know?
And Daisy was part of the relaxation, really.
Yeah, Daisy was part of that. Daisy was very much part of that undemanding presence with whom he could let the cares of the world briefly slip off his shoulders.
So the king and queen arrive. There was trepidation on their part just to begin with, because they realize that they aren't terribly popular. The king is living under the shadow of his more glamorous brother, who had already abdicated. And then they come into this house, which was not maybe entirely unlike something that they've seen before. It's a country home, has some of the trappings of aristocracy, but it's a little bit less kept up, I would say, than probably that they were used to. But they were also confronted with some overtly anti-British depictions, which actually was interesting when I saw that in the movie. And you can talk about that a little bit, because they actually still have it up, some of these things on display at the actual FDR home upstate.
Well, these are cartoons of the 1812 war between Britain and America. When I think I was in Washington yesterday, and somebody explained that British forces came in and burnt the White House down. I didn't know that until yesterday. But these are American cartoons depicting the British sailors and soldiers as sort of apes and monkeys and subhumans. They're sort of comic early 19th century cartoons, which still adorn the walls of Springwood, and which caused the king some concern when he spotted them on his bedroom wall, as though FDR was being deliberately provocative, and I think FDR probably was being deliberately provocative. I mean, the other thing that was arranged for them was a picnic, and the picnic was held up at Top Cottage, and even that was a kind of political act, because the king and queen were being welcomed into a proper American household, and Eleanor and FDR wanted them to partake in a proper democratic, pluralistic American event, i.e. a picnic where you ate hot dogs. And the royal party were really upset about the hot dog. They were very trepidatious about the hot dog. They didn't know whether they were being made fun of, or whether something would be made of this hot dog. They'd never even eaten a hot dog, clearly. And when the moment came, the king was presented with a silver platter of hot dogs, and the whole picnic went silent. And sure enough, he picked up the hot dog and bit it, and everyone started clapping and applauding. In a way, that was the kind of pivot in the whole weekend.
And that really just sort of melted the ice, and actually had a major significance in a breakthrough between U.S. and British relations at the time.
Well, when the king left that afternoon, they get on the train to go back to Canada. He I was going to say emailed. He sent a telegram to the president saying that their weekend marked a really important development in the special relationship between our two countries, which is a phrase we've been using happily or unhappily ever since.
Yeah, and actually, I think I just heard that recently. Bloomberg, our mayor in New York, did a speech at the Conservative Party conference in I don't know, in the UK somewhere.
Okay, yeah.
And he used that exact
Did he? Yeah.
Same thing, the special relationship, and that comes back to George VI from that letter.
It does. That was his. He coined that. And indeed, whenever you guys have an election, I always look out for the pictures of the candidates eating hot dogs, because it kind of makes them look cool and man of the people, etc., etc.
All right, we're going to check out another clip from Hyde Park on Hudson. So this was right after, I think, Daisy got her first glimpse of the king and queen. Was that correct?
This is the afternoon they arrived.
In the afternoon they arrived, yeah.
And the president was eager to offer the king a cocktail, and the president's mother was eager to offer the king a cup of tea. Yeah. And when it came to it, the king walked into the room that you've just seen, and on one side of the room was a big silver tray with tea. And on the other side was a big silver tray with cocktails, and he was obliged to choose between them. I won't tell you which way he went, but
I won't either. All right. So talk about the casting. Bill Murray, of course, plays FDR, and I did get a chance to see the movie, and I can tell you it's a marvelous performance. Talk about was this something? Was he just your absolute choice to be FDR? And talk about some of the other cast as well.
Well, it's odd when you make a film. You usually have 2 or 3 people in mind for the leading part, and if you don't succeed with the first one, you move onto the second. But I realized pretty early on that I didn't really want to make this film without Bill Murray, which is problematic because Bill Murray is so very, very hard to get hold of. He doesn't have an agent. Yeah. He has a kind of weird 0800 number where you can leave a sort of hopeless message. And he has a lawyer, but as Bill subsequently pointed out to me, every time you phone up the lawyer, it's just costing Bill Murray a load of money, and the lawyer can't get hold of him either. So I thought I got him a script through somebody who lives here. I'd made a film here recently, and the props girl was called Chris Moran, and she was a friend of Bill's. So I made a little care package for Bill with a script and a love letter and, you know, some of my films, and sent it off into the ether, expecting not to ever hear anything back. And then about 3 months later, I was in Los Angeles and my cell phone went, and it was somebody impersonating Bill Murray. And in fact, that person turned out to be Bill Murray. So that was good. And from then on, we had this sort of sporadic exchange of calls as I tried to kind of, with a tiny hook, catch this very big fish. And eventually, he committed to doing the thing. I mean, he was interested from the very beginning. He was intrigued, and had a real appetite for it. But he knew it was tricky as well. You know, Bill doesn't normally do parts which are such a distance from who he is. So it's a departure for him. But he did a lot of homework and prepared very thoroughly for the movie. And he's great in it.
Yeah, I would think just the accents themselves must have been a lot of work. I mean, there's particular accents that aren't part of the general New York and even U.S. vernacular, I guess. Yeah. Yeah,
I mean, the Roosevelts were very, very Anglophile in the way they spoke. And he had to learn how to walk with these special calipers that were made for Roosevelt, and with crutches, and we spent time with victims of polio, and learned how to be carried and how to drive a car only using his hands, and all kinds of stuff like that. I mean, one of the remarkable things about the Roosevelt story, which you probably all know, but I didn't, was that during his presidency, nobody knew that he was wheelchair bound. And in fact, the only two photographs we have of Roosevelt in a wheelchair were taken by Laura Linney's character, the character you've just seen in that clip. And one wonders how, if today a similar kind of conspiracy would ever hold, you know, a conspiracy where the press agreed to withhold such a sort of defining truth about a president, about a major political figure.
Yeah, I mean, that was just really interesting, just the whole media aspect about how the media did hold back and did not have pictures of Roosevelt showing his handicap. And indeed, I believe you mentioned, when we were in Toronto, I think you mentioned that it was Daisy who actually took the only photo of him.
Yeah, she took the only two photographs of him in a wheelchair.
That exist, yeah. Okay, well, should we look at clip number 2? Yeah. So that was a kind of a hilarious, sort of awkward moment all the way through, and Queen Elizabeth, or showing Queen Elizabeth her room and trying to have nice chit-chatty conversation with Eleanor, and then...
Well, you know, Eleanor doesn't hold much truck by, you know, hereditary monarchy, and why should she? So there are various moments where Eleanor is sort of required to curtsy and can't quite bring herself to curtsy. She sort of does a kind of awkward half bob.
But meanwhile, and then FDR's mother, meanwhile, was quite starstruck by them being in.
Yeah.
Talk about a little bit, just while you were in production, I heard a little birdie told me that Bill Murray liked to play music while at the...
Bill had a habit of bringing a very sort of loud music box onto the set. You could hear him approaching. You knew when he was coming because you could hear kind of Eagles music from like 200 paces away, and it was nice. I mean, he brought a very nice atmosphere into the room.
All right, so let me see what we might open up for questions. Yeah.
Here we go. Third row, all the way to your right.
Hello.
Hi.
You mentioned sort of the awkward situations, sort of the inherent humor. Do you write it like that, or you just kind of trust the material is going to take care of itself and that the actors are going to kind of do their thing? I mean, how do you construct all that without looking like you're trying to make it awkward?
Well, I mean, it's there in the writing. It's written like that, but then it usually needs a little bit of unraveling with the actors to make it feel, you know, clear but real. And it's a matter of finding the balance, I guess, between it being funny and it being real. And if in doubt, in my view, always always err on the side of it being real, and if it's funny, hopefully it'll look after itself.
Was there sort of a little bit of free reign for the actors to kind of feel their way, or are you a little more?
Well, we had a rehearsal week in which the writer was there, and but by and large the script was respected by the actors. It's a good piece of writing, and I think that I can't remember messing around with it too much.
Okay. Anybody else?
I see a question in the second row.
How did the British aristocracy dealt with American aristocracy who had wealth?
Say that again. How did the British aristocracy?
The British aristocracy dealt with American aristocracy who had actually wealth, as opposed to British aristocracy who didn't.
It felt to me like the Roosevelts were sublime American aristocracy. I mean, almost American royalty. The Roosevelts thought of themselves as being, upper Hudson Valley aristocracy par excellence. So I know that Roosevelt was always ridiculously impressed by royals, and he made a trip to England in about 1920 when he was Secretary of State for the Navy, and was incredibly impressed to meet the then King and Queen of England. I think it's possible that an interest in royalty is even stronger here than it is in England, when we're rather cynical about our royal family and very keen to see the faults and peccadillos and errors and difficulties that they're in, and it feels like a constant adventure for when members of the royal family come here. Most recently the couple who just got married. I can't remember what they're called. William and somebody, somebody very beautiful. And it seems that they're even more of a fairy story in this country than they are in the UK. But it's still their kind of brand is still a dazzling success in England. Is dazzling, and it doesn't seem to diminish. This new generation of royals are very glamorous and young, and once again, poor old Prince Charles is being eclipsed by his own family in a way. The man who's still waiting to lurch onto the throne with a Zimmer frame.
Do you have a question? Right next to you.
A historical, political question. Recognizing the fact that even at that time, the British royalty really had no purview over the formulation of foreign policy. That was the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. Yet in the US, Roosevelt clearly was at the helm of the decision-making process. How much, if at all, did this weekend have an impact on either American or British decision-makers to cement the alliance or to further the Lend-Lease Act and the ultimate entry of the United States into the war?
Well, the Lend-Lease Act was Roosevelt's initiative, as you know, and although they have no constitutional power, the royal family then and even now still have political and commercial effect. When they go when they visit another country or whatever, I think it's all judged very carefully in conjunction with British foreign policy. I think it's an arm of British foreign policy, in fact, and this was no exception. The visit to Canada and America in 1939 was done absolutely with the connivance and blessing and consideration of the British Foreign Office. So I think it had a major, to answer your question, I think it had a major impact on American public, the public view Americans had of England, and I think that it did sow the seeds for the support that Roosevelt gave to Britain during those first 2 years of the war before Pearl Harbor. And I think that had a massive impact on Hitler, actually, because I think that Hitler realized that America probably would come into a war if he invaded Great Britain in 1940. And I think that it was a seismic and brave and odd decision by Roosevelt to go against his party and his country, and very far-sighted of him to realize that this was a war that was going to ultimately impact on this country and on the world. I think most people thought the war would fizzle out in Europe, but
I see a question over here in the middle, in the second row.
How about Daisy's character? Did you have Laura Linney in mind from the very beginning, like Bill Murray, or did you hold auditions and she made you see Daisy in her?
a bit of both. I mean, I saw a few other actors for that part, but once I'd met Laura, I figured that she was absolutely the right person. I mean, she's a very interesting historical character, Daisy. Do you know anything? Do you know a little bit about Daisy? She's at the beginning of the film. She's from a rich family who've lost all their money in the Depression. She's living with a maiden aunt. She's really a nurse to her aunt, and she's kind of a spinster who's given up on everything, rather like a sort of Jane Austen character. And then she gets drawn into this court, the court surrounding FDR, and it's a great journey for her.
And interesting because she probably played a very heavy role in our history, and yet so many people do not know her.
I think that's right, yeah.
We have time for 2 more questions. I have one. Oh, that's great. Right here, all the way to the right, front row.
This is kind of a 2-part question. First one being, who's your biggest influence as a filmmaker, and what's next?
Can I answer the second bit of that first, because that's the easy bit? I'm shooting a film in Paris. I start 3 weeks' time shooting a little film about a couple in their 60s. They're just about 60, and they're going back to Paris to celebrate their wedding anniversary. Their grown-up kids have just left home, and they're going to find out really whether they have anything left for each other. So they go back to the hotel that they stayed in 30 years before, and of course now this hotel is horrible and tiny and disastrous, and the wife goes nuts, and she jumps in a cab and she insists that they go to like the Georges V or somewhere like that, and she slaps her credit card on the receptionist counter, and she says, "Give us the best room in the house." And from there on, the weekend goes weird in a fun way. And one of the people they meet there is someone he was at college with, played by Jeff Goldblum, and they kind of see their lives in the context of his life, which is much more glamorous. Blah 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 blah. So that's what I'm doing next. What's my biggest influence? That would be hard for me to answer in such a short space of time. I can't single out a single person or thing. I mean, I spent my first 20 years of my career working in theatre, and I still do theatre all the time. So I guess that's my background. That's where I came out of.
And we have our final question right in front of you in the third row. I'm behind you.
Hi. I have a question based on, because you said this is like you said King's Speech is a prequel, kind of a Academy Award trailer to this movie. How well do you think the casting for King George that you chose would like transition to this movie for people who've seen King's Speech? It was a really, really big film, so yeah.
Good question. Well, I mean, everyone at the moment has Colin's face imposed upon Bertie, and all I can hope is that when they come and see this story, which is a different story and a different version of that character, that face wears off gradually as the film unspools, and they end up with Sam West's face replacing it. But it's like playing Hamlet. There's room for 1 million actors to do these parts, so I feel very, very comfortable with Sam's brilliant characterization.
And I'll second that, haven't seen it. So the Hyde Park on Hudson has its U.S. premiere at the New York Film Festival tomorrow, and Focus Features will have it rolling out in theaters beginning December 7th. Starting. And thank you to Roger Michell for joining us at the Apple Store here today. And thanks, New York Film Festival. Thank you, Apple. Thanks, Focus.